We often know that an artist is nearing the end of a renowned career when they go on a greatest hits tour. The greatest hits album format first gained popularity in the 1960s and 1970s with artists like Johnny Mathis, the Rolling Stones, Johnny Cash, other big names releasing compilation albums. And by the 1990s, these type of albums were commonplace for the most popular artists. Personally, I was introduced to some of my favorite bands and musicians like Billy Joel and Frank Sinatra, the Beatles, through their greatest hits albums. And I was surprised to learn that the all-time best-selling album in the United States is a greatest hits album by the band The Eagles. In fact, in August of 2018, the album titled Their Greatest Hits was selected for preservation in the National Recording Registry by the Library of Congress as being culturally, historically, and artistically significant. And in many ways, the book of Deuteronomy reads a bit like a greatest hits album, retelling and reprising many of the stories we have read in previous books. In our Parsha this week, Va'at, Moses reviews the events of the journey from Mount Sinai to the border of Canaan and reiterates the laws given to the Israelites. The Israelites are positioned just outside the Promised Land, waiting to end their long sojourn in the wilderness and begin a new phase of their existence. Our tradition holds that in the wilderness, God gave us all 613 mitzvot at Sinai. Yet in several of our texts, the prophets and sages try to simplify and distill our tradition into core principles, core values, the greatest hits of our sacred scriptures. The prophet Micah taught that the Torah was built on just 3 commandments: do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. Rabbi Akiba taught that the great rule of Torah is stated in the mitzvah found in Kedoshim, Leviticus 19, love your neighbor as yourself. And Rabbi Hillel famously summarized Torah al regel echad, on one foot, when he taught a student converting to Judaism, what is hateful to you, do not do unto others. The rest is commentary, now go and learn. My friend and colleague, Rabbi Max Chaikin, teaches how these texts illustrate an ancient desire to synthesize the wisdom of the Torah, a desire that we modern Jews can truly resonate with. It makes us wonder, if we had to choose only one portion to summarize the entire Torah, which would it be? One parsha to impart as much wisdom as possible, where would we turn? We could make arguments in favor of various different portions. Perhaps we'd start at the beginning. The creation narrative of Bereshit exemplifies God's infinite power and intimate awareness of human beings. Or perhaps we would turn to Parshat Ve'era, with the troubling story of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, but also the multifaceted themes of faith and charity, infertility, sexual security, the covenant, and on and on. We might choose Parshat Ki Tetzei, the Torah portion with the most amount of mitzvot, or as Rabbi Akiba suggested, Parshat Kedoshim, also known as the Holiness Code, which includes the command to love our neighbor as ourselves. There is no right answer, and perhaps even posing the question is not exactly right, but I've posed the question, and so we have to consider Parshat Va'at as a strong contender. In this week's portion, we find a compilation of the Torah's greatest hits, both in law and narrative. It opens with Moses' reminder that we Israelites were unruly, grumbling, complaining along the way as we wandered through the wilderness. He tells us that we should be prepared for an imminent change of leadership as we prepare to enter the promised land. And Moses warns us to heed the laws and the rules that God has given, and that we shall not add anything nor take anything away from them. Because all of this teaching, all of this, literally this Torah, comes from the covenant made with God. We find a restatement of the 10 Commandments, which for the first time are named Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 sayings. We read the watchwords of our faith, the Shema, the first paragraph of Yahavta, verses stating our belief in God's unique oneness and instructing us how to love God by teaching Torah to our children. We are reminded to recall our redemption from slavery in the land of Egypt and are warned against turning to idols in several verses. Though perhaps most importantly, Va'at Hanan reinforces the idea of our own free will. We are charged with the agency of our lives. While we cannot always control our circumstances, that has become abundantly clear to us in recent months, it is clear that we are responsible for the ethical and spiritual choices we make in this life. For Moses would not have needed to warn us to keep the covenant and remember the commandments had our observance to the commandments been preordained. If we had no agency to murder or to steal, to bear false witness, we would not need the 10 Commandments' injunctions to not do those things. It's similar to why we have rules of don't run by the pool. You only need a rule if it is necessary. If it were easy to ignore the pull toward false gods, we would not need so many warnings to persist in our belief in God's oneness. Parshat Va'achanan demands our participation in living out Torah. Moses speaks to all of the Israelites with the instruction to listen, study, and observe the laws. The nuance matters here. Listen, study, observe. Later in the Parsha, Moses states, "B'chol haderech asher tziv'a Adonai Elohechem etchem telechu." You all shall walk along the path that God has commanded. The presence of the words telechu, walk, and derech, the path, relate directly to the Hebrew word halakha, the classical Jewish system of practice and law. The word literally meaning walking, because we are supposed to infuse our movement through life with these ideas. Our movement through life infused with Torah. To listen to Torah, to study to Torah, observe Torah. Even for those of us who do not live by strict adherence to Jewish law, no Judaism can exist entirely without halakha. It is a way of bringing idea to action. As Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel would put it, this is the importance of the deed, the act. In her book, Engendering Judaism, Rabbi Dr. Rachel Adler teaches that a halakha, a path-making, translates the stories and values of Judaism into an ongoing action. Va'at Hanan reminds us that we all have the ability and, perhaps more important, the invitation to walk the path of Jewish living and translate faith into deed. Just as Hillel, Akiba, the prophet Micah attempt to capture the entirety of Torah into perfectly packaged, synthesized sound-bite teachings. Vat Hanan also offers a verse that we can read as an overarching principle of Jewish living, one of Torah's greatest hits. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 18 reads, "Do what is right and good in the sight of the Eternal, that it may go well with you." We may not always find it easy turning the wisdom of Torah into action, but just as we can be guided by principles like love thy neighbor, or what is hateful unto you, do not do to others, we can rely on the call to action found in Parshat Va'alchanan. Do what is right as we make our ethical and spiritual choices throughout life. Shabbat Shalom.